Hey guys, tonight we are going to travel back to a time when winter was not just a season you complained about while sitting under a blanket with a cup of tea. No, for medieval peasants, winter was a yearly visitor that arrived with freezing temperatures, endless darkness, and the charming little question of whether your tiny house would still be standing by spring. So tonight, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe turn down the brightness of your screen, and settle in. Because we are going to spend the next little while inside the world of ordinary medieval villagers. Not kings, not knights, not the people wearing shiny armor while dramatically riding horses through castles. Just regular people. The farmers, laborers, families, and villagers who lived in small wooden homes and somehow managed to survive some of the harshest winters Europe had ever experienced. People who woke up every morning, looked outside at a frozen landscape, and basically thought, "Wonderful, nature has decided to attack us again." And somehow, they continued. When most people imagine medieval life, their minds usually go somewhere very specific. A castle on a hill, a noble feast, knights carrying swords, a king sitting on a throne while servants bring him expensive food. And yes, those things existed. But the majority of medieval people did not live anywhere near that world. Most people were peasants. They lived in villages. They worked the land. They grew crops, raised animals, repaired houses, paid taxes, and tried to survive whatever the weather decided to throw at them. And winter was the biggest challenge. Today, when winter arrives, many of us think about warm houses, heating systems, thick blankets, and maybe complaining because the car takes 5 extra minutes to warm up. Medieval peasants would have found that absolutely fascinating. Imagine telling someone from the 12th century, "Sometimes my house feels slightly cold, so I press a button and warm air comes out of the wall." They would probably stare at you. Then they would probably assume you were some kind of wizard. Because for them, warmth was something you fought for. It was something you created with your own hands. It was firewood collected months earlier. It was wool clothing repaired again and again. It was dried food stored carefully because there was no supermarket waiting around the corner. Winter was not an inconvenience. Winter was a test. And the coldest nights were the hardest part. During the day, people were moving. They were working, gathering fuel, feeding animals, repairing tools, keeping their bodies active. Movement created warmth. But nighttime was different. At night, everything became still. The fields disappeared into darkness. The wind became louder. The temperature dropped. And inside a medieval peasant home, there was no magical barrier separating you from the outside world. The house itself was often fighting against the cold. Most peasant homes were simple structures made from materials that were available locally. Wood, mud, straw, stone, if you were lucky. A common building method was called wattle and daub, which sounds like something from a medieval cooking recipe, but it was actually a way of making walls. Basically, wooden sticks were woven together like a giant basket. Then this framework was covered with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung. Yes, dung. The medieval peasant home was basically held together with a combination of farming knowledge and things that modern people would probably prefer not to touch. But the funny thing is, it worked. The dung was not added because medieval people were trying to create the world's strangest decorating style. It was practical. It helped strengthen the walls. It helped fill gaps. And when winter arrived, every little bit of insulation mattered. Because these houses were not sealed buildings. They were full of tiny openings, cracks around doors, spaces between wooden boards, gaps in the roof, places where cold air could sneak inside whenever it wanted. And cold air was very determined. It did not need an invitation. It simply entered. A medieval peasant could spend an entire day repairing their home, filling holes, adding fresh mud, replacing damaged thatch. And then one strong winter wind could come along and basically say, "Nice house. Would be a shame if something happened to it." The roof was another problem. Many homes had thatched roofs. From a distance, they looked beautiful, almost like something from a fairy tale. A small cottage, a smoking chimney, A peaceful village. Very charming. But living inside one was a different experience. Thatched roofs needed constant maintenance. Rain could weaken them. Snow could become heavy. Animals could sometimes make themselves comfortable inside. Nothing says cozy winter evening, quite like hearing movement above your head and wondering if your roof has gained a new roommate. The windows were also very different from what we know today. Glass windows were expensive, very expensive. Most ordinary homes did not have large glass windows allowing sunlight to enter. Instead, many openings were covered with wooden shutters, cloth, or animal hides, which meant during winter, houses were dark, very dark. The only reliable source of light after sunset was usually the fire, and that fire was the center of everything. The hearth was not just where food was cooked. It was the heart of the medieval home. It provided warmth. It provided light. It provided a place where families gathered. It was basically the medieval version of electricity, heating, and entertainment all combined into one smoky little area. Because there were no televisions, no phones, no internet, no late-night scrolling. When the sun went down, people gathered around the fire. They talked. They told stories. They repaired clothing. They shared news from the village. They simply watched the flames move, which honestly sounds peaceful. And medieval peasants understood something that modern people often forget. Warmth is not something you simply have. It is something you maintain. Every day, every night, every winter. Their lives were built around small victories. A full storehouse, a working roof, a healthy animal, a strong fire, a warm corner of the house. Things that seem ordinary today were precious achievements back then. And as the winter nights became longer and colder, medieval families developed countless small strategies to survive. They changed how they slept. They changed how they dressed. They changed how they used their homes. They even changed how they arranged their families around the fire. Because when the temperature dropped and the wind started pushing against those thin mud walls, survival became a group project. Nobody survived winter alone. And the next thing we need to understand is perhaps the most important part of medieval winter survival. The place where everyone fought the cold together. The tiny, smoky, crowded home that was both shelter and battlefield. The medieval peasant house. A place where humans, animals, fire, and freezing weather all shared the same small space. And somehow, they made it work. Before we imagine a medieval peasant surviving a freezing winter night, we need to understand the place where that survival actually happened. Because the first enemy was not always the cold outside. Sometimes it was the house itself. Today, when winter arrives, most people think about warmth as something automatic. You close a window, turn a heater on, grab a blanket, and complain that the room is still a little chilly. A medieval peasant did not have that luxury. Their home was not designed to defeat winter. It was designed to simply exist, and that was already considered a success. The average peasant house was small, usually built from whatever materials were available nearby. In many parts of Europe, this meant timber, mud, clay, straw, and stone. Modern people might look at such a building and call it a simple cottage. But calling it a cottage almost makes it sound too comfortable. It was less like a cozy countryside home and more like a wooden box trying its best not to collapse. The walls were often made using a technique called wattle and daub. Basically, thin wooden branches were woven together like a giant basket, and then covered with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung. Yes, animal dung. A material that modern homeowners would probably not choose for their dream renovation project. But medieval people were practical. If something helped keep the wind outside, it was useful. And during winter, keeping the wind outside was everything. Because cold air was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. A freezing night in the medieval countryside was not a peaceful experience. There were no insulated walls, no double-glazed windows, no central heating. No magical little machine sitting in the corner quietly making the entire room warm. Instead, there was a fire, a small fire, and that small fire had to do everything. It had to cook food. It had to boil water. It had to provide light. And most importantly, it had to keep people alive. The problem was that medieval houses were often built with a central hearth. The fire burned in the middle of the room, while smoke escaped through a hole in the roof or through gaps in the walls. This meant the inside of the house was usually filled with smoke. A peasant family could spend an entire winter breathing air that would make modern firefighters immediately leave the building. But at the time, nobody had much choice. A little smoke was better than freezing. The fire was the heart of the home. Families gathered around it. Children slept near it. Adults repaired tools, prepared food, and told stories beside it. The warmth of the fire created one of the few comfortable moments during the long winter nights. But there was always a problem. Firewood. Because a fire needs fuel, and fuel was not unlimited. A medieval peasant could not simply walk into a supermarket and buy a bag of perfectly cut dry logs. They had to collect it. They had to chop it. They had to store it. And most importantly, they had to make sure they had enough before winter arrived. Because running out of wood during a freezing winter could become a serious emergency. The forests around villages were extremely important. They provided wood for buildings, tools, fences, and heating. But peasants often did not completely own these forests. Many forests belonged to nobles or monasteries, meaning that even collecting enough wood to stay warm could sometimes involve restrictions. Imagine being cold in your own home, and then discovering that the nearby forest technically belonged to someone else. Medieval life had a special talent for making simple problems complicated. A peasant family preparing for winter had to think months ahead. During warmer seasons, they gathered wood whenever they could. They cut branches. They collected fallen trees. They dried everything carefully, because wetwood was almost useless. Wetwood creates smoke. Wetwood burns poorly. Wetwood turns a cold night into an even colder night. And winter was not forgiving. The house itself also had to be prepared. Before the first snow arrived, families repaired holes in the walls. They covered openings. They added extra layers of straw. They fixed roofs. A tiny crack in summer was annoying. A tiny crack in winter could feel like having an open door to the freezing outside world. The floor was another challenge. Most peasant houses had dirt floors. Not beautiful wooden floors. Not warm carpets. Just packed earth. During winter, that ground could become cold and damp. To make it slightly more comfortable, people often spread straw or rushes across the floor. The straw helped with warmth. It also helped with cleanliness, although cleanliness is a relative word here. The same material used as flooring could collect dirt, food scraps, and whatever else entered the house. So the medieval home was warm, but not exactly what we would describe as fresh. Still, for the people living there, it was home. A place where families survived together. A place where children grew up. A place where generations shared the same small space. And one of the most important survival strategies was simple. Everyone stayed close. A medieval family did not spread out across multiple rooms. There was usually only one main room. Parents, children, animals, and sometimes servants all shared the same area. Privacy was almost non-existent, but warmth was valuable. Bodies produced heat, and during the coldest nights, every bit mattered. A sleeping family packed together under blankets and coverings could preserve much more warmth than a single person alone. The medieval peasant bedroom was not a bedroom in the modern sense. Often, people slept on simple beds made from wooden frames filled with straw. The mattress was not soft. The pillow was not luxurious, and the blankets were usually made from wool. Wool was extremely important because it kept warmth even when it became slightly damp. For medieval people, wool was almost a survival technology. A wool cloak, blanket, or tunic could mean the difference between discomfort and danger. Clothing itself played a major role. A poor peasant did not own many outfits. Usually, they had a small collection of practical clothing that had to last for years. A tunic, a cloak, a pair of simple shoes, maybe some extra layers if they were lucky. Winter clothing was not about fashion. It was about not losing heat. The wealthy could afford fur-lined clothing and expensive fabrics. The peasant had wool, and wool had to do the job. At night, when temperatures dropped, because the food eaten during winter was often not the same food people enjoyed during the warmer months. Summer and autumn were seasons of activity. Fields produced crops. Gardens provided vegetables. Animals were raised. Fruits were collected. But winter was different. Winter was the season of using what had already been saved. A medieval peasant family spent much of the year preparing for these dark months. They dried food. They stored grain. They preserved meat. They collected whatever could survive until spring. Because once winter arrived, there was no easy solution. The first and most important food was grain. Grain was the foundation of medieval life. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye were extremely valuable. Not because they were exciting. They were not. Nobody was gathering around the medieval dinner table saying, "Wonderful news, everyone. Tonight we have another bowl of plain grain." But grain was reliable. It could be stored for long periods. It could be turned into bread. And bread was the main source of calories for many peasants. For many medieval families, bread was not just part of a meal. Bread was the meal. A wealthy noble might enjoy different dishes, expensive spices, and fresh meat. A peasant often depended on a simple loaf that provided energy for difficult physical work. And even bread was not always the soft, fluffy bread people imagine today. Medieval bread could be heavy, dense, dark, sometimes made with cheaper grains. The kind of bread that felt like it could survive a battle, which was useful, because sometimes the person eating it felt like they were fighting it. Rye bread and barley bread were common among poorer communities. They were not luxurious, but they filled the stomach. And when you spent your days working outside in freezing weather, filling the stomach mattered. Another important winter food was porridge. Porridge was simple. Grain mixed with water or milk and cooked over the fire. It was cheap. It was easy to prepare. And it could feed an entire family. A large pot hanging over the hearth could become the center of daily life. The same pot might be used again and again. A little grain, some vegetables, maybe a few herbs, perhaps some meat if the family was fortunate. The result was a thick, warm meal that helped people survive another cold day. It was not a feast. But during winter, warm food itself was a luxury. The problem was that food storage was never perfect. A bad harvest could create disaster. If crops failed during summer or autumn, winter became much more dangerous. Medieval peasants lived very close to the edge. There was rarely a huge supply of extra food waiting. A successful harvest meant survival. A poor harvest meant fear. And the worst months were often near the end of winter. This period was sometimes called the hungry gap. The old supplies were running low. The new crops had not arrived yet. The fields were still empty. The animals had consumed much of the stored feed, and families had to stretch whatever remained. This was the moment when careful planning mattered most. A family that wasted food in autumn could suffer badly later. Nothing was thrown away. Almost everything had value. Bones could be used for making broth. Old bread could be softened with water. Vegetable scraps could become part of another meal. Modern people often talk about reducing food waste. Medieval peasants had already mastered that idea. Not because they were trying to be environmentally friendly. Because wasting food could mean going hungry. Animals were also part of winter survival. A medieval household was not only a human home. It was often a place shared with animals. Chickens, goats, pigs, cows. Sometimes these animals provided warmth, food, and security. A pig was not simply an animal. It was future meat. A cow was not just livestock. It provided milk. A chicken provided eggs. Every creature had a purpose. For a medieval peasant, winter was not only a battle against freezing temperatures. It was also a battle against something much simpler. Something modern people rarely think about anymore. Darkness. Because when the sun disappeared, the entire world changed. Today, darkness is almost just a minor inconvenience. A small problem solved with a simple movement. A finger touches a switch. A room fills with light. A street becomes visible. A person can stay awake until midnight or 2 in the morning, surrounded by glowing screens, electric lamps, televisions, and countless little lights that make night feel almost like another version of daytime. The modern world has learned how to ignore the sun, but medieval peasants could not. For them, the sun was the clock. The sun decided when work began. The sun decided when work ended. And during winter, the sun became something precious. Because winter days were short, sometimes painfully short, a farmer could wake before sunrise, step outside into freezing air, work for hours, and still feel like the day had barely begun before darkness slowly returned. The fields disappeared. The forests became shadows. The paths between villages became difficult to see. And eventually, everyone returned home. Not because they were finished with all their tasks, but because there was simply no more daylight to continue. The night had arrived, and the night belonged to darkness. A medieval peasant home at night was nothing like a modern home. There were no bright lamps hanging from ceilings, no glowing bulbs, no hallway lights, no small device sitting beside the bed waiting to tell someone the time. The inside of the house slowly disappeared after sunset. The walls became harder to see. The corners became black spaces. The wooden beams above became hidden in shadows. A familiar room during the day could feel completely different at night, almost like another place. The only reliable source of light was usually the fire. The same fire that cooked their meals. The same fire that warmed their hands. The same fire that protected them from freezing temperatures. It was the heart of the home. And during winter, it was almost like another member of the family. Everyone depended on it. But a fire does not create the kind of light modern people are used to. It does not brighten an entire room. It creates a small island of visibility. Around the flames, people could see. A few feet away, everything faded. The room existed in pieces. A face appearing in the firelight. A hand moving across a piece of clothing. A wooden bowl placed beside the flames. Then beyond that, only darkness. The shadows moved whenever the fire moved. The walls seemed alive as the flames flickered. And for a medieval family sitting around the hearth, this was normal. This was their evening. Winter made the darkness even more noticeable. During summer, long days allowed people to spend hours outside. The sun remained in the sky. Farmers worked. Children played. Animals were cared for. There was always movement. But winter slowed everything. The fields rested. The animals spent more time sheltered. The village became quieter. The long nights created a different rhythm of life. A slower rhythm. A rhythm controlled by fire and candlelight. Modern people often try to fight the night. We extend the day. We create artificial sunlight. We continue working long after sunset. But medieval peasants did not fight darkness. They accepted it. The darkness was part of life. When the sun went away, life became smaller. People moved indoors. Voices became quieter. Activities changed. The evening was no longer about productivity. It was about surviving until morning. The fire became the center of medieval winter life. Families gathered close around it, not only because it was warm, but because it was useful. A winter evening near the hearth was a time for many small tasks. Clothing was repaired, because buying new clothes was not simple. A torn shirt could not just be replaced. A broken shoe could not simply be thrown away. Everything had value. Every piece of fabric mattered. Every tool mattered. A family might spend hours repairing items that had already been repaired many times before. Needles moved through cloth. Wooden tools were fixed. Knives were sharpened. Farm equipment was prepared for the coming seasons. Winter was not a time of complete rest. It was a time of slower work. Work done inside. Work done beside a small flame. And then there was conversation. Something that modern people sometimes forget. Before entertainment came from screens, it came from people. A medieval winter night could be filled with voices. A father explaining old farming traditions. A mother telling children stories from her childhood. An elderly person remembering winters from decades earlier. A traveler sharing news from another village. The fireplace was not only a source of heat. It was a place where memories survived. Stories were extremely important in medieval communities. Many ordinary people could not read. Books were expensive. Written information belonged mostly to religious institutions, wealthy families, and educated people. So knowledge traveled through voices. A story could carry history. A song could preserve a tradition. A warning could save someone from repeating a mistake. The oldest person in the room might know things that nobody else remembered. And every winter night was another opportunity to pass those memories forward. But darkness also made ordinary life harder. Small tasks became difficult. Imagine trying to sew clothing while only seeing through weak firelight. Imagine preparing food when half the kitchen disappears into shadow. Imagine searching for a tool inside a small wooden home where every corner looks almost identical. Simple mistakes became common. A person could drop something and spend several minutes searching for it. The roads disappeared under snow. Travel became dangerous. Neighbors who lived only a short distance away could suddenly feel far away. The village became quiet. The outside world almost disappeared. For some people, winter must have felt like living inside a tiny island surrounded by cold. But medieval communities understood something important. Winter was easier together. A person alone faced the cold differently. A person alone had fewer hands to help, fewer voices to comfort them, fewer resources to share. But a family around a fire had strength. A village working together had a chance. The medieval village was not just a collection of houses. It was a survival system. Neighbors watched over each other. People shared information. They helped repair damage. They supported families who struggled. Because a terrible winter did not only affect one person. A failed harvest affected everyone. A sick farmer affected everyone. A family without enough food became the concern of the entire community. Everyone understood one simple truth. Survival was connected. One household's problem could eventually become the village's problem. And slowly, the night continued. The fire became smaller. The flames lowered. The room became colder. The conversations became quieter. Children fell asleep near their families. Animals settled into their spaces. Adults prepared themselves for another morning. Another cold morning. Another day of surviving. Because the medieval peasant did not defeat winter. They did not conquer the cold. They simply endured. Night after night. Darkness after darkness. Waiting for the season to finally change. Waiting for the first signs of spring. Waiting for the sun to return. But winter darkness was only one challenge. Because the cold did not only steal comfort. It threatened health. And for a medieval peasant, a simple illness during the darkest months could become something much more dangerous. A fight for survival itself. The medieval winter was already difficult. The cold, the darkness, the shortage of food, the endless effort to keep a small fire alive. Every part of winter demanded something from a peasant. More wood, more preparation, more patience, more endurance. But winter had another enemy. An enemy that could enter a home without making a sound. An enemy that did not care how carefully someone had prepared. Disease. Because winter was not simply a season of discomfort. For medieval people, winter could be a season of fear. A season where a simple cough could become something much more serious. A season where one person becoming sick could change the future of an entire family. Today, when someone catches a common illness, most people expect to recover. They rest. They drink something warm. They take medicine. They wait. And usually, life continues. The illness becomes an unpleasant memory. But for a medieval peasant, sickness was different. There was no modern hospital waiting nearby. No quick trip to a doctor. No antibiotics. No advanced machines that could look inside the human body. Many diseases that seem simple today were dangerous because people did not understand what caused them. A person could become sick during the coldest month of the year. And suddenly the entire household faced a new problem. Because every person in a medieval home had a role. A healthy adult was not only a family member. They were part of the survival system. Someone who collected firewood. Someone who repaired the roof. Someone who prepared food. someone who cared for animals, someone who worked the land, someone who kept the household functioning. If that person became too sick to work, the consequences spread quickly. A sick farmer meant fewer supplies. A sick parent meant more pressure on everyone else. A sick worker during winter could be especially dangerous because there were fewer opportunities to recover. The season was already taking everything people had. Disease simply took more. Winter sickness was dangerous because the human body was already under pressure. Cold temperatures forced the body to spend extra energy just trying to stay warm. Every moment outside required effort. Every journey through snow or freezing rain weakened a person, and food was often limited. A medieval peasant did not have a modern winter diet filled with fresh fruits, vegetables, and variety. Many winter meals depended on stored foods. Grains, dried vegetables, salted meat, simple soups. These foods could keep people alive, but they did not always provide everything the body needed. A person who spent months eating limited meals could become weaker, and a weaker body had a harder time fighting illness. The medieval peasant house created another challenge. It protected people from the freezing air outside, but it also brought people close together. Families often shared the same living space. Parents, children, elderly relatives, sometimes even animals. The house was warm because everyone and everything stayed close. But this closeness also meant sickness could travel quickly. One person coughing beside the fire, one child becoming feverish, one family member struggling to breathe. Soon others might begin showing the same signs. The very thing that protected people from the cold could also help disease spread. The medieval home was a place of safety, but it was not always a place of health. One of the most common winter dangers was respiratory illness. Coughs, fevers, chest problems, difficulty breathing. Cold air already made breathing harder. But inside the home, another problem existed. Smoke. The fire that kept people alive also filled the house with smoke. Many medieval homes had poor ventilation. Smoke stayed inside. It irritated the eyes. It affected the lungs. It covered clothing and walls. A person could spend years living beside a fire, breathing air that was far from clean. The combination of smoke, cold weather, and illness created a difficult situation, especially for the elderly, especially for young children, especially for anyone already weakened by hunger. For parents, a sick child during winter must have been terrifying. A child could not simply be taken to a modern clinic. There were limited treatments, limited knowledge, limited options. Parents could provide warmth. They could prepare food. They could give herbal remedies. They could pray. They could sit beside the child through the night. But sometimes, there was nothing more they could do. And that was one of the hardest parts of medieval life. People were not unaware of suffering. They cared deeply. They loved their families. They wanted to help. But their world did not always give them the tools to save the people they loved. Medieval medicine was a mixture of experience, tradition, and beliefs. People observed nature. They collected herbs. They created treatments. They passed knowledge from one generation to another. Some remedies probably helped. Some were harmless. And some probably made people question whether the treatment was actually better than the illness. Because medieval medicine was still searching for answers. The idea that tiny organisms cause disease was unknown. People did not understand bacteria or viruses. Instead, they had different explanations. Some believed sickness came from an imbalance inside the body. Others believed certain illnesses came from unhealthy air. Others connected disease with spiritual causes. When people had few medical solutions, they searched for explanations wherever they could find them. Religion played a major role in dealing with sickness. For many medieval people, faith was a source of comfort. A sick person might pray for recovery. A family might ask saints for protection. A community might gather together and pray during difficult times. Religion could not always cure disease, but it gave people something important: hope. And during a winter where so many things were uncertain, hope mattered. But illness was not only caused by cold temperatures. Another hidden danger was hunger. A person who entered winter already weakened by poor nutrition had fewer defenses. The body needed energy. It needed strength. It needed resources. But many peasants had very little extra. This created a dangerous cycle. Cold made people weaker. Weakness made illness easier. Illness made work harder. Less work meant fewer resources. Fewer resources created more weakness. Winter became a chain of problems. And breaking that chain was extremely difficult. Keeping a medieval home clean also presented challenges. People did care about cleanliness. They washed. They maintained their homes. They understood that some things were unhealthy. But they did not understand infection the way modern science does. They did not know about invisible germs spreading through contact. Waste management was difficult. Water sources could become unsafe. Animals living close to humans created additional problems. The medieval village was not designed with modern sanitation. It was designed around what people had available, and what they had available was often limited. Still, medieval peasants were not helpless. They were survivors. They understood their environment. They knew which plants could be useful. They knew how to prepare certain remedies. They knew which foods lasted through winter. They knew that a weak person needed extra care. Their knowledge was not modern, but it was built through generations of experience. Every winter taught people something. Every difficult season left behind lessons. Sometimes survival depended on small things. A dry blanket, a warm drink, a stronger fire, a neighbor arriving with extra food, a family member staying awake beside a sick person during the night. Because winter illness was rarely faced alone. Community mattered. A village survived because people depended on each other. One winter, one family might have extra supplies. Another winter, that same family might need help. Life could change quickly, and everyone understood one simple truth. Today it might be your neighbor. Tomorrow it might be you. But the dangers of winter did not end with cold, hunger, and disease. Because medieval peasants were not only fighting nature, they were also living inside a difficult social system. Even after surviving freezing nights, even after surviving sickness, they still had obligations. Taxes, rents, duties, payments to their lords. And during the hardest months of the year, these demands could become another burden. A peasant could survive the winter storm. They could survive an empty pantry. They could survive a dangerous illness. But then they still had to ask one important question. After everything they worked for, how much of it actually belonged to them? Because in medieval life, survival was not only about defeating the weather. It was also about surviving the world created by other people. And for peasants, that struggle would continue long after the snow melted. The medieval peasant had many enemies. The freezing wind, the empty fields, the long nights, the sickness that arrived without warning, the hunger that waited quietly in the background. But there was another struggle, one that did not come from the sky. It did not arrive with a snowstorm. It did not appear as ice on the roads. It came from the world people had created, society, because a medieval peasant was not completely free to live as they wished. Their life was connected to a system that had existed for generations. A system where land meant power, and the people who controlled the land controlled much of the lives of those who worked on it. A peasant could survive the cold. They could survive hunger. They could survive disease. But they still had to survive the demands placed upon them. To understand the struggle of winter, we first need to understand medieval village life. Most ordinary people in medieval Europe were farmers. Their entire existence depended on the land, the soil, the weather, the harvest, the animals. A good year could bring stability. A bad year could bring disaster. But many peasants did not own the land they worked. Instead, they lived on estates controlled by powerful landowners called lords. This system was known as manorialism. A manor was more than just a large farm. It was almost like a small world by itself. It included fields, woodlands, pastures, a village, a church, sometimes a mill, sometimes a manor house where the lord lived. The lord controlled the land. The peasants worked it. In exchange, they received protection and access to the resources needed to survive. At least, That was the simple explanation. The reality was much more complicated. A medieval peasant family usually had their own small area where they could grow food. They planted crops. They raised animals. They collected resources. They worked hard to create enough supplies for their household. But they also had obligations. They were expected to provide labor for the Lord. Certain days were spent working on the Lord's fields instead of their own. The crops they produced were not entirely theirs. A portion could be owed to others. Payments could be required. Fees could appear. And these responsibilities did not disappear when winter arrived. In fact, winter often made them harder. Imagine spending an entire year preparing for survival. A family wakes before sunrise. They work during the hottest days of summer. They plant seeds. They remove weeds. They protect crops from animals. They pray for good weather. Then finally, the harvest arrives. The family gathers what they can. They store grain. They preserve food. They prepare for the cold months ahead. After months of exhausting work, they finally have supplies. But then winter comes. And with winter comes another reality. Not everything they produce belongs only to them. A portion may be required for taxes. A portion may go to the church. A portion may be owed to the Lord. The same supplies that a family carefully saved for survival could slowly disappear. The medieval world was filled with rules. Rules about land. Rules about work. Rules about resources. A peasant could not always simply do whatever they wanted with the things around them. Want to grind grain into flour? The village mill might belong to the Lord. Want to bake bread in a large oven? That oven might belong to the Lord. Want to collect wood from certain forests? That could require permission. Want to hunt animals? That could bring serious punishment. To modern people, some of these restrictions seem strange. Imagine needing permission to use a forest near your home. Imagine paying a fee just to use equipment needed for everyday life. But this was part of medieval society. Land was power, and the people who controlled land controlled opportunities. Winter made this imbalance more obvious. During warmer months, peasants had more options. There was constant work. Fields needed attention. Animals needed care. Harvests needed to be collected. The days were long. There was always something to do. But winter slowed everything down. The fields rested. The work became limited. The income became smaller. The food stores became lower. Yet the responsibilities remained. The Lord still expected what was owed. The church still expected its share. The family still needed food. The animals still needed care. The fire still needed fuel. Winter was the season when every shortage became more visible. A poor harvest could completely change a family's situation. A farmer could do everything correctly. They could work from sunrise to sunset. They could carefully prepare their fields. But one bad season could ruin everything. Too much rain. Not enough rain. A late frost. A disease affecting crops. A storm destroying fields. Nature did not care how hard someone worked. And after a bad harvest, winter became much more frightening. Because winter removed possibilities. There were fewer jobs, fewer resources, fewer chances to recover. A family entering winter with enough supplies had hope. A family entering winter already struggling faced a much harder battle. But it is important to understand something. Medieval peasants were not simply helpless victims. They were incredibly skilled. They understood their world better than almost anyone. They knew the seasons. They knew the soil. They knew animals. They knew how to preserve food. They knew how to repair tools. They knew how to survive with limited resources. A modern person might look at medieval life and think, how did anyone survive like that? But medieval peasants looked at their world differently. This was the world they knew. They had generations of knowledge behind them. They understood the small details that kept a family alive. Which would burn longer? Which animals needed extra protection? Which foods lasted through winter? Which signs showed that weather was changing? Their knowledge was not written in books. It was passed through experience. And despite having so little power, peasants were the foundation of medieval society. The castles, the towns, the armies, the churches, all of them depended on ordinary workers. The food that supported nobles came from peasant labor. The materials used to build great structures came through countless hours of work. The entire medieval world rested on the shoulders of people who rarely received attention. They were not kings. They were not knights. They were not famous. But without them, the medieval world would have stopped functioning. The difference between rich and poor became especially clear during winter. For a noble family living in a castle, winter was uncomfortable. The stone walls were cold. The roads were difficult. Travel was limited. Even wealthy people disliked harsh winters. But they had options. They had larger food stores. They had servants. They had warmer clothing. They had more rooms. They had access to resources that ordinary families could only dream about. A peasant family had fewer choices. Their entire survival could depend on a few simple things. Enough firewood. Enough food. A healthy animal. A strong roof. A working tool. One small disaster could create a huge problem. A broken tool was not just an inconvenience. It could affect work. A sick animal was not just an animal. It could affect transportation and farming. A failed crop was not just a bad season. It could threaten the entire future. But winter was not only suffering. Even in difficult times, people searched for moments of happiness. Because humans do not survive only through food and shelter. They survive through hope. Winter brought traditions, religious celebrations, community gatherings, shared meals, stories around fires. One of the most important celebrations was Christmas. For medieval Christians, this was a major event. Villagers gathered in churches. Families spent time together. People celebrated the end of another difficult year. Even poor families tried to create moments of joy. Maybe the meal was simple. Maybe the decorations were basic. Maybe the celebration was small. But it mattered. A song, a story, a warm fire, a group of familiar faces. Sometimes these small moments were enough. Winter also strengthened community bonds. Neighbors helped each other because everyone understood the same reality. No one was completely safe. A family that had enough food this year might need help next year. A healthy farmer today could become sick tomorrow. A strong household could suddenly face disaster. Helping others was not only kindness. It was survival. Because a village survived together. Children growing up in medieval villages learned these lessons early. They learned that preparation mattered. They learned how to protect animals. They learned how to collect resources. They learned how to respect the seasons. They learned that survival was never guaranteed. It was something people worked toward every single day. But even the most prepared family could not control everything. A sudden storm, a freezing week, a disease outbreak, a shortage of food. Nature always had the final word. And sometimes, winter pushed people beyond ordinary choices. People had to make decisions they never wanted to make. Should they save food for tomorrow? Or eat more today? Should they keep an animal alive? Or use it as food? Should they burn valuable supplies now? Or save them for a worse night? Because the hardest nights of medieval winter were not always the coldest. Sometimes the hardest nights were the ones when a family sat around a fading fire, looking at their remaining supplies, and quietly wondering, will we have enough to see the morning? There is a moment every winter when preparation ends. The wood has been collected. The food has been stored. The walls have been repaired. The animals have been sheltered. The roof has been checked for leaks. The clothing has been patched again and again. The family has done everything possible. And then comes the waiting. Waiting to see what winter will bring. Because for a medieval peasant, winter was not simply a season on a calendar. It was a test. A test of preparation. A test of patience. A test of whether the decisions made months earlier were enough. Would the supplies last? Would everyone stay healthy? Would the weather remain manageable? Would spring arrive before everything disappeared? These questions followed families through the darkest months. Because medieval people lived much closer to survival's edge than most people today can imagine. A modern person facing a difficult winter usually has options. There are stores. There are deliveries. There are heaters. There are hospitals. There are countless systems designed to prevent a bad situation from becoming a disaster. A medieval peasant had almost none of these advantages. If the food ran low, there was no quick solution. If the firewood disappeared, there was no easy replacement. If sickness entered the house, there was no simple treatment waiting nearby. The family had only what they had prepared, and once those supplies were gone, the choices became harder, sometimes painful, sometimes desperate, because medieval survival was not about comfort. It was about making sure there was another morning. One of the hardest decisions involved food. A family could have a limited amount of grain stored away, perhaps sacks of wheat, perhaps barley, perhaps oats. These supplies represented months of work. The grain was not just food. It was security. It was the difference between surviving winter and facing hunger. Every bowl of porridge mattered. Every piece of bread mattered. Every handful of grain removed from storage was a decision. During a long winter, people had to constantly calculate. How much can we eat today? How much must we save for tomorrow? How long until spring? How long until new crops appear? This was the cruel mathematics of medieval survival. A larger meal today could create hunger later. A smaller meal today might allow the family to survive another week. So people learned to stretch everything. Nothing was wasted. A leftover piece of food was valuable. Bones could be used to make broth. Old bread could be softened with water or added to other meals. Even food that modern people might consider simple or unpleasant could become important. Because hunger changes the way people think. When survival is uncertain, food stops being something to enjoy. It becomes something to protect. A medieval winter meal was often less about pleasure. It was about endurance. The question was not, what would taste good? The question was, what can keep us alive? The most dangerous period was often not the beginning of winter. The beginning still carried some hope. The storage rooms were full. The animals still had supplies. People believed they had prepared enough. The true danger often arrived later, near the end of winter, the period when everything started running out. This was sometimes called the hungry season. The old food was almost finished, but the new harvest was still far away. The fields remained empty. The trees were bare. The gardens produced nothing. The earth looked completely asleep. A medieval farmer could look across frozen fields and know that nothing useful would come from them for many weeks. This waiting period was exhausting, because people were not only fighting cold, they were fighting time. A family could survive one more week, but could they survive 5 more? Could they survive another storm? Another illness? Another unexpected problem? Winter became a slow battle where every day mattered. Animals became one of the biggest decisions. A family might own a cow, a few chickens, perhaps a pig, maybe a goat. These animals were extremely valuable. They provided milk, eggs, meat, fertilizer, labor, future security. A healthy animal could help a family survive the next year. But animals also needed food. And during a difficult winter, feeding animals could become almost as difficult as feeding humans. A farmer might stand inside a cold barn looking at a weak animal and face an impossible choice. Should the animal be kept alive, or should it be used as food before it becomes too weak? A pig that was supposed to provide meat later might need to be slaughtered earlier. A sick animal might need to be sacrificed before it became useless. These decisions were not easy, because medieval families did not see animals as simple objects. Animals were part of daily life. People knew them. They depended on them. A cow was not just a cow. It was milk. It was survival. It was a future resource. But winter forced people into choices where there was no perfect answer. Sometimes saving the family meant losing something else. Firewood created another constant worry. A medieval home depended on fire. The fire cooked meals. The fire provided warmth. The fire gave light. The fire was the center of family life. But the fire also consumed resources. Every night, pieces of wood disappeared. A large pile collected during autumn slowly became smaller. And every cold night brought the same question. How much longer will it last? When supplies became low, people became creative. They collected fallen branches. They gathered small pieces of wood from wherever they could. They used lower quality fuel. They burned materials that produced less heat and more smoke. Anything that could create warmth became valuable, because warmth was not a luxury. Warmth was protection. A cold house could weaken the body. It could make sickness worse. It could make children and elderly people especially vulnerable. The medieval peasant did not simply sleep through winter. They survived through winter. There was a difference. Night itself was another challenge. A freezing winter night inside a small house was not peaceful. The wind could pass through small gaps in the walls. The roof could make strange sounds during storms. The fire could slowly become weaker. People woke because they were cold. Children moved closer to their parents. Families pulled blankets tighter. Someone might wake during the night to check the fire, because a fire that disappeared could change everything. The darkest hours were often before sunrise. The house was quiet. The outside world was frozen. The animals were still. Everyone waited for morning. And when morning arrived, the struggle continued. There was no day off from survival. Even during the hardest winters, work continued. Animals still needed care. Tools still needed repair. Clothes still needed fixing. Food still needed preparation. Seeds needed sorting for the coming planting season. A medieval peasant could not simply say, "Winter is too difficult. We will wait." Because spring depended on what happened during winter. The future harvest depended on preparation. A damaged tool ignored in winter could become a problem during planting. A sick animal ignored could create problems later. Survival required thinking beyond the present moment. People had to survive today while preparing for tomorrow. But not everyone survived every winter. This is one of the difficult realities of medieval life. The people we remember from history are usually the survivors. The families who continued. The villages that remained. The communities that rebuilt. But many others suffered. A harsh winter could leave families weakened. A shortage of food could create lasting problems. A disease could remove important members of a household. A single disaster could change someone's entire life. Winter was powerful because medieval people understood something modern societies often forget. Nature does not negotiate. The cold does not care about plans. The snow does not care about wealth. The wind does not care about social position. A storm could arrive at the home of a wealthy noble, or the small house of a poor farmer. The difference was protection. The wealthy had more ways to fight winter. The poor had fewer. For peasants, survival came from preparation, knowledge, and cooperation. A village was more than a collection of houses. It was a survival network. People borrowed tools. They exchanged information. They helped repair damaged homes. They shared news about weather conditions. They helped families who had lost supplies. A neighbor bringing a small amount of food could make a huge difference. A few extra pieces of wood could help someone survive a freezing night. Community was not only kindness. It was necessity, because everyone understood one important truth. Winter eventually visits everyone. The rich, the poor, the powerful, the powerless. The cold does not respect titles. Snow does not stop because someone owns a castle. A freezing wind does not care about social status. And yet, every spring that arrived proved something remarkable. Despite hunger, despite sickness, despite darkness, despite exhausting nights, people survived. They learned from previous generations. They adapted. They found ways to continue. They turned a small fire into warmth, a simple meal into strength, a crowded house into shelter, a village into a family. They survived not because winter was easy. Winter was never easy. They survived because humans are remarkably adaptable. They accepted the world they lived in. They understood its dangers, and they found ways to continue living inside it. Because for medieval peasants, winter was not something they defeated. It was something they endured, night after night, week after week, until finally, the snow began to disappear. The frozen ground softened. The first signs of green returned. Spring had arrived. Another winter was finished. But surviving the winter was only the beginning. Because after months of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. There was another challenge waiting: rebuilding, preparing, and beginning the endless cycle once again. The fields would need to be planted. The animals would need care. The tools would need repair. Life would continue, just as it had for generations before. And somewhere, inside a small medieval home, another family would sit beside another fire, grateful that they had made it through one more winter. After months of freezing nights, empty cupboards, dark evenings, and endless battles against the cold, winter finally began to disappear. But it did not leave quickly. Winter never left the medieval world like a dramatic storybook ending. There was no single morning when everyone opened the door and suddenly found a warm green landscape waiting outside. The change was slow, almost impossible to notice at first. A little less ice on the ground, a little more sunlight through the clouds, a small stream beginning to move again after weeks of being frozen, a few birds returning to the quiet fields, tiny green plants pushing their way through the cold earth. Small signs, almost insignificant. But to medieval peasants, these signs meant everything. They meant one thing: they had survived. Another winter had passed. For a modern person, the arrival of spring might simply mean warmer weather, a change of season, a reason to spend more time outside. But for medieval peasants, spring represented something much deeper. It represented survival. It represented another chance. Because winter had taken a great deal from them. The food stores were lower. The animals were weaker. The firewood piles were smaller. Clothing had become worn from constant use. Tools had suffered from months of work. And the people themselves carried the exhaustion of the cold season. Winter left marks, not only on the land, but on the people who endured it. The first weeks of spring were not a time of complete relaxation. In many ways, they were another difficult period. The hardest part of winter was over. But the new harvest was still far away. The fields were not producing food yet. The crops planted in spring would take months before they could be collected. This created a dangerous gap. The old supplies were nearly finished. The new supplies had not arrived. A family could survive the winter and still face challenges afterward. The journey was not finished. Farmers began preparing immediately. The tools that had been repaired during winter were brought outside. The fields were inspected. The soil was checked. Animals were moved carefully after spending months indoors. Everything had to begin again. A medieval farmer understood that survival was not a single victory. It was a continuous cycle. Every season created a new challenge. Spring required planting. Summer required growing and protecting crops. Autumn required harvesting and storing. Winter required surviving. The entire year was connected. One mistake in one season could create problems many months later. The first days of spring were filled with work. Homes needed attention. Winter storms could damage roofs. Walls needed repairs. Storage areas needed cleaning. Clothing needed fixing. Nothing was thrown away easily. A broken object was not simply replaced. It was repaired, adjusted, used again. Because medieval peasants lived in a world where resources were limited, they understood the value of everything they owned. A simple tool could represent hours of work. A warm blanket could represent years of careful preparation. A healthy animal could represent a family's future. Nothing was ordinary. Everything mattered. Then came one of the most important moments: planting. A farmer placing seeds into the soil was doing more than farming. They were making a promise to the future. Each seed represented hope. Hope that the weather would cooperate. Hope that animals would not destroy the crops. Hope that disease would not ruin the harvest. Hope that enough food would grow to carry the family through another year. A medieval peasant could not control nature. They could only prepare and hope. Looking back at the winter they had survived, it is easy to focus only on hardship. The cold, the hunger, the darkness, the illness, the difficult choices. And yes, medieval winters were extremely challenging. But there was another side to the story. There was determination. There was patience. There was community. There were families sitting together beside a small fire. There were neighbors helping each other. There were children learning skills from their parents. There were traditions passed from one generation to the next. Even in the darkest months, people still found reasons to continue. A medieval peasant did not survive because life was easy. Life was rarely easy. They survived because humans have always been capable of adapting. They learned their environment. They respected nature. They prepared carefully. They used every resource available. They accepted that some things were beyond their control. And they continued anyway. A small house. A small fire. A simple meal. A family together. Sometimes that was enough. Today, most people experience winter very differently. We enter warm homes. We turn on lights. We adjust the temperature with a button. We buy food whenever we need it. We rarely think about whether the firewood will last until morning, or whether there will be enough grain to survive another month. But hundreds of years ago, these questions were part of everyday life. The cold was not just uncomfortable. It was a challenge that shaped people's entire existence. So tonight, as you lie comfortably in your warm bed, with light around you, with warmth protecting you, remember the people who faced winter without electricity, without modern heating, without hospitals nearby, without the countless conveniences that we often forget. Remember the medieval families who watched the sun disappear early, who gathered around small fires, who waited through long dark nights, who hoped for the first signs of spring. Their lives were difficult, but their endurance was remarkable, because every spring that arrived carried a quiet message. The winter was temporary. The darkness would end. The cold would pass. And life would continue. The fields would grow again. The animals would become stronger. The days would become longer. And another year would begin. Thank you for joining this slow journey into the hidden world of medieval winter survival. If you enjoyed this relaxing history story, consider subscribing for more long, calm, and sleepy journeys into the past. More forgotten lives. More ancient struggles. More stories from people who lived centuries before us. Now, close your eyes. Relax. Let the fire slowly fade. Let the old village disappear into the darkness. And allow the sounds of the past to slowly drift away. Good night, Crescent Moon.